Hello, beloveds of God, and welcome to Tuesdays for Nurture. This is a webinar series every Tuesday at 3:30 where we faithfully focus on education for the people of God. Our topics are from faith-filled politics to interviews of key leaders to how-tos in congregational life and the impacts of current realities on the life of the church. And each webinar features what you can do to change the church and the world closer to the world that God imagines for us. I am so happy today to be here alongside dear friend and colleague Heather Kimmel, who is the General Counsel for the United Church of Christ. And it's been 7 years, we were just talking about, that you've been in that role and helping support local congregations and conferences and the denomination as a whole in being attentive to how we can be faithful stewards of our processes and procedures in alignment with the law. So yeah, welcome. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I can't believe I've been with the Office of General Counsel for 7 years. It seems like yesterday. I still love my work, so I guess that's a great thing. And I really love doing things like this where I can talk to all of the people about all of the cool things like bylaws and copyright and all the stuff I get to get totally geeked out over.
You and many people who are on this call, whether live with us now or watching the recording, are here because, you know, for many of us, myself included, sometimes when I get into the legalese, I look at the words and I have no idea what the meaning is. And, you know, it takes it takes that kind of training. And I'm so grateful to have you as a resource in these conversations and ongoing in terms of how do we support our local churches. There's a couple of things I want to say about the context of this webinar. And that is, we are in a time where things are changing so very quickly, you know, in the world, in our society. A lot of people are under stay-at-home orders still. A lot of people are trying to figure out how to faithfully worship apart or certain degrees of together. We're doing online ministries. Some churches I've heard have taken the timing to think through the internal processes and procedures behind the making everything happen. So I've gotten lots of questions. So before we go into all that, I know that you have some particular ways and disclaimers that you'd like to add at the beginning.
So just like ministers have their code of ethics, attorneys do as well. And so I do need to say that just by virtue of me being here today, I don't represent any particular viewer of this webinar or any particular question asker. And I cannot give legal advice for any particular situation. So I think that's important to make clear. So the information I'm giving here today is general. And if you're viewing this webinar and it's been a couple months, you know, laws change all the time. So it's really important that if you feel like you need legal advice for your church's particular situation, that you seek out an attorney who's capable of doing that for you at that time.
And I know that, you know, some people are going to bring in questions to this webinar. And as we're doing that live, there's a Q&A down at the bottom of your screen that you can add questions into, and we'll definitely get a chance to engage some of those as we get towards the end. And if you're watching the recording thereafter and you have questions for Heather, you can either get to her via your conference, be in conversation with your conference, or they'll put you in conversation with somebody who's more local because state laws vary. And that's important to know as well. I'm trying to think, what else was I saying? Oh, questions, disclaimer, context. I think we're good. So we're going to dive right into that, which I know many of you are so excited to talk about, which is bylaws.
Yeah, so I get so many questions about bylaws, and the questions that are coming right now are really directed toward, we want to have a meeting, but we can't meet in person. And so how do we do that? So I'm going to get there, but I want to take you through a couple things about bylaws first, because I think it's important to understand what bylaws are, what they're intended to do, what they should contain, how they're amended, all that good stuff. And we'll do it in as exciting a way as we can do that, because I do get a lot of eyes glazing over when I talk about bylaws. So
I'm excited.
So bylaws are really just one part of a church's governing documents, right? They are the part that governs internal church administration. Most churches, and you're going to hear me use the language of most, many today, because there's always going to be some exceptions somewhere. Most churches,
United Church of Christ.
Yeah, right? Okay. So most churches are incorporated. And so a church will also have what's called a charter or articles of incorporation. Some churches also have a constitution and separate bylaws. And that's a practice that goes way back. So it's not really necessary to have a separate constitution and bylaws, but if you do, the provisions that are in the Constitution are usually a little bit more important, a little bit more difficult to amend than what's in your bylaws. So we're talking about things like denominational affiliation, the purchase and sale of church assets, and things like that. And those usually need to be amended by what we call a supermajority vote. So that's going to be, like a 2/3 vote. So that's what's really in the Constitution. The Articles of Incorporation and the bylaws together constitute a contract between the members of the church and the congregation. And let's just think about that for a minute, because it's not necessarily a contract like we think of when, we have somebody come out and build a fence for us. But it's more about managing and being transparent about the mutual expectations of the church vis-a-vis its members. So a church doesn't really exist apart from its members. And so it's really important that the internal affairs of the church, the way that those are governed, be set forth in a way that's easily understandable for the members. And we're not going to try to hide the ball on anything from our members, right? Especially not in the UCC, which has, the tradition is that the congregation governs itself, right?
So is it fair to say that the bylaws are an articulation of the power of the members?
Yes, and the power that they are giving to others to act on their behalf. Ordinarily, in a membership corporation, the power is going to reside with the members, and then certain powers the members are going to delegate to a board of directors. That's our church council. So the bylaws are going to be very clear about what powers are reserved to the congregation and what powers the church council has. So the powers that we're going to reserve to the congregation are things like calling a pastor, voting on the annual budget, and important things of that nature. And then the day-to-day administration is probably going to be delegated to the church council. I will say that state churches have to follow state corporate codes. Churches that are incorporated have to follow state corporate codes. If your church is not incorporated, there's a good chance there is also a law in your state that may treat your church as though it's incorporated. And state corporate codes vary all over the place, from state to state. Every state is different. So it's hard for me to talk about what might apply in Ohio and also what might apply in Connecticut. But you do have to make sure that your bylaws are in compliance with that state's corporate code, because if they're not, it's going to be the state's corporate code that controls and not your bylaws.
So I get a lot of emails about bylaws, and a lot of times people are like, we're looking at our bylaws, we want to adjust and do X, Y, and Z. And the first thing that I reply is you have to be in conversation with a nonprofit lawyer of your state. Yes. So you can't just kind of like go and make it happen, whatever you want to happen, because I know that there are implications when you change your bylaws to what happens thereafter. So one of those implications is about making major decisions on behalf of the church. And I know you've talked about that in conversation with steeplejacking before. So can you speak to that a little bit about what your bylaws can do to protect your church from something like steeplejacking?
Sure. A well-written set of bylaws can make it very difficult for a church to lose its denominational affiliation, I guess is what I want to say. If you have the particular provisions in place in your bylaws that may require perhaps a couple of different votes to leave a denomination that are spaced apart, and these would be congregational votes, and we all know how hard it is to call a congregational meeting anyway, right? That's why there's only one a year. But this would be something that you would put in your bylaws to leave the denomination the congregation has to meet twice, 180 days apart, and vote by 3/4 of, you know, whatever quorum you have, or perhaps it's a different number than a particular quorum, in order to do that. Certainly the spacing of a decision like that would give a lot of time for that particular church to work out and to be in conversation with the conference and the association over those issues, and also perhaps may prevent the church from splitting into factions, which is sometimes what we see in a steeplejacking situation. Yeah.
You know, I've been reminded by people in chat and Q&A that I said steeplejacking, but not everybody knows what that means. So when I'm saying that, I'm talking about what happens when, you know, I'm speaking, I don't know enough of circumstance to say I've seen this happen. So I'm speaking generally. So I'm not talking about any particular congregation, but it often happens where leadership shifts significantly, whether it's a new minister as called by the congregation or a new family that has entered the congregation, and shifts the power dynamics within the leadership so drastically that the congregation then would make a decision to leave the United Church of Christ because of, you know, often it's our justice values or something like that, or they're feeling upset with something that is happening. And Heather, you can nuance that with more intention. I'm speaking very, here's how I would define it in conversation if we were on the street.
So I think you're pretty much on the mark for that. How I have actually seen it play out is a church hires a pastor, and they may not go through the conference's search and call process. And so they may hire a pastor who's not a UCC pastor. And that pastor then increases the membership of the church to the point where there are many folks who came because of that pastor, and that pastor is not in any way aligned, or maybe not fully aligned with the values of the United Church of Christ, such as they are lived out in that church. And so then the conversations about leaving the denomination take place. And honestly, what I generally tend to see in that is the pastor tends to be grabbing for power, trying to move the congregation out of kind of more of a congregational model and into more of a pastor controlled model, is really where I see that and how I see that playing out. And you brought up, one of the things that you said brought up a really good point that I would like to make, is one of the questions I get at least 6 times a year, even when we're not in a pandemic, is, can we suspend our bylaws? And the answer to that is no, you cannot suspend your bylaws. There are very limited exceptions to that. Like if your bylaws actually say this particular bylaw can be suspended on this vote and it's a procedural issue, then that's a possibility. But in general, you can't suspend your bylaws. And the context that I get this conversation in is, we want to try something new, so we want to suspend our bylaws. Well, the bylaws tell you what the relationship is with the members and the church. And if you suspend them, you won't know what that is. And all of the state law defaults will then apply. So that's something really important to keep in mind, is if you suspend your bylaws, it's not like nothing is governing your church, it's the state law that's governing your church. So we want to be really careful about that as well.
And so I know a lot of churches are looking at their bylaws now and seeing how they match or don't match the current reality of how their churches are operating. So for example, I know churches, sometimes the bylaws are written, you know, decades before, and they contain really specific things like, the church shall have a committee of trustees, which contains 15 people, 3 of each household, and then everybody and their mom has a part-time job at the church. And you've got some really clear recommendations about how to define the roles and responsibilities within bylaws numerically, as well as specifically, that I think are really helpful. So I want to invite you to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So if you are a church and you are considering rewriting your bylaws and you're ready to take this on, I would invite you to consider what a set of bylaws would look like if you only put in your bylaws what the law required you to put in your bylaws. And then any other procedures and policies of the church would go in policies or procedures or resolutions that would be adopted by the church. There are things that are really important to have in your bylaws. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of those, and then if you have comments, I would love to hear from you. Membership. How can members join, and how is membership terminated? So I have never seen a set of bylaws from a church that didn't have how members could join, but I've seen a lot of sets of bylaws from churches that don't say how membership can be terminated. Most churches are membership corporations, and so you have members, and it's really important to say how those members join and how that can be terminated, because you don't want to try to be making up a process for that when you need to do it right then. And that would be voluntarily and involuntarily, if that wasn't clear.
Important things to note.
Important
And I've heard you say, I've heard you say before that when you talk about percentages in terms of membership, or when you talk about membership and quorum, that it's really important to use percentages of people instead of numbers of people, because the narrative of membership organizations, not only churches, but all membership organizations, has a narrative of shift and what is often said as like the decline of members, not necessarily engagement, not necessarily impact, but definitely if we have written into our bylaws that there must be 15 people on this particular committee and there's only 15 people in the church, then that's an issue. But if we say 100% of the people need to be present, then 100% is achievable. 60% is achievable.
I love your optimism. So yeah, that's really important. I want to tell you, check your state law on quorum. So that's the first thing we're going to do, is check your state law to see if it has minimum quorum requirements. And then set your quorum not at a particular number of folks, but at a percentage of folks, an achievable percentage for you. If you are, for example, a church in Northeastern Ohio, and your members are wealthy and they're over 65 and they all go to Florida for 8 weeks out of the year, and your congregational meeting is in February, you want to be able to have a quorum that you can achieve. So normally that's going to be set at some percentage that's going to be in accordance with, whatever the church wants to do with that, in accordance with state law, that also reflects the importance of the decisions that the congregation is making, right? So we probably don't want to have a quorum of 5% of members to make really important congregational decisions. So it's important to keep that in mind. We're acting as the body of Christ. So
yeah, I think this is a really important nuance. There's two things I'm thinking about. The first is, this is a really important nuance between contract and covenant. They both have different languages, and a covenant is not a contract. It is a theological understanding of how we're working together. And I'm thinking about things like behavioral covenants, which we are going to talk about in a webinar upcoming. And in terms of bylaws, to frame it in terms of contracts provides a pathway about how power in the people of the members is distributed across the membership of the congregation. The second thing, you want to add anything into that before I?
Oh, that's good.
Okay, cool. The second thing is, you mentioned about this hypothetical church where 60% of the members or all of the members go to Florida. So let's say they have a Zoom meeting. What happens there?
Yeah, let's talk about remote meetings, because that's really what I want to get to. So, and every state's law is different. If you have a state law that says you can hold a meeting, and how states usually phrase it is by communications equipment. Okay, that's what they say. They say you can hold a meeting by communications equipment if your bylaws do not prohibit it. That's some states. Other states say you can hold your meeting by communications equipment if your bylaws say you can do it. So that's another thing. And then some states are silent altogether. And remember, we're talking about two different kinds of meetings here. We're talking about congregational meetings, and we're talking about meetings of the church council, which are going to be governed by two different provisions of the corporate code. So you got to check all of those things, which is why it's a great idea, if you're amending your bylaws, get an attorney, get a local attorney who can look it over for you, and make sure you have the appropriate provisions in place. So if you have a state law that says a meeting can be held remotely as long as your bylaws don't prohibit it, and your bylaws are silent, you can hold your meeting remotely. Of course, if your bylaws say yes, you're golden anyway. If your bylaws say no, you can't hold a meeting remotely.
And then we have to go about the work of looking at the bylaws in conversation with the local law and adjusting them via congregational vote in alignment with said bylaws in order to hold a meeting remotely.
That's correct.
And
So
yeah, there's implications there, especially when we think about like search and call processes, when we think about the swift adjustment that many of us have made since March to being attentive to each other in this digital way. Yeah.
So I want to say a few words about risk and holding electronic meetings. So I have had some churches say, we don't really care what our bylaws say. We're going to go ahead and hold the electronic meeting. So there are risks that come along with that. And one of the risks is that any decisions that are made at a meeting that is not a properly held meeting according to the bylaws could be challenged in court and could be legally ineffective. So you'll want to know that that's a risk before your church decides that that's the path they want to walk down. And an attorney can help you walk through that. And an attorney can also maybe help you find alternatives to that. I mean, one of the things you can do before you have a meeting is consider what part of this work that you're trying to do at the meeting is really critical, and read your bylaws carefully to figure out if your church council has the power to do that work in the absence of a congregational meeting, or has the power to delay that work if it can be delayed. So those are all important points, but one of the things I'm certainly not going to tell you is go and have an electronic meeting if your bylaws say you can't do that, or the state law says you can't do that.
Yeah, and like this is the part where it gets really hard, right? We titled this webinar, How to Not Add an Unintended Legal Battle to Your Church's Worries, because a lot of this is kind of like when I'm saying we because I am a pastor, when we go through seminary, it's not like here's the rule book for Robert's rules, here's nonprofit stuff, and when you get to a church, you will be doing everything legally, attentively to the most recent editions of the law as we know it. No, because we get to church and there's church council and we've always done it this way and that makes a lot of sense. So let's continue to do it that way. And, so there's this like doing the best we can. And now that we know better, we can do better. And so there's a lot of that there too. Do you want to add anything more about bylaws before we kind of move in this digital realm?
Yeah, I do I have a couple more things because, I love talking about bylaws. So, so when we talk about electronic meetings and how those can be held, please know an electronic meeting is not the same thing as people sending emails back and forth. Okay. An electronic meeting is one where the participants can hear each other and participate in real time. So voting by email, while some state corporate codes allow what we call action without a meeting, there are very specific rules around that. So make sure you know those rules before you take action outside of a meeting. And it's not just, we had this many yays and this many nays by email. Okay, so be very aware of that. The other thing that I want to say is if you can get your bylaws amended, if there's a way to do that, all churches should be looking at ways to add these remote meeting provisions in. Most states now, I think, have remote meeting laws. And so this is really one way, if we're going to be updating our bylaws at all, this is something that we should definitely be paying attention to.
I would imagine that most states are looking at that if they are not there yet already.
The other thing, real quick, is that check your bylaws also for whether it allows voting by proxy, because that is a way that you can get voting done without having a meeting, whether it allows absentee ballots, because that is a way that you can get done what you need to get done without a meeting. It's going to require a lot of work either way, probably for church council members, but you can get the work done if you have those provisions in your bylaws that are consistent with your state law. Okay, I think I'm done with bylaws unless we have questions.
Yeah, I do want to say, beloveds of God, this is a lot. It's a lot, and it's okay. You are learning along the way now. You can do better, and there is support for you as you continue to try and do your best. Reach out to your local conference, reach out, and we will get, all of this information is also going to be in the follow-up email to all registered participants today. So wanted to say that too. Like sometimes we hear all these things and a lot of what we hear is just kind of like, well, what's the worst case scenario? And I know that a lot of what Heather is talking to is coming from having witnessed the worst case scenario in ways that we can't necessarily speak into. So she's brilliant in that way. And I don't know all the details, but it's worth being attentive along the way. So I do want to lift up one of the questions that came up, which is this kind of like back and forth, right? So would we have to have a virtual meeting to change the bylaws, but the bylaws don't let it happen? It's just like, no. I mean, you can have, here's what I would imagine, and Heather, you can correct me all the way, is that I would imagine you could probably have a virtual meeting to talk about it, but you cannot have a meeting to vote. True, false?
Yeah. So, well, it's a little more nuanced than true, false. So you should know if you vote at that electronic meeting, that decision may not be a valid decision and could be challenged. If that decision is later ratified at a properly called meeting, then you're good, right? But in the meantime, if you have that one member who wants to challenge that decision, that may be what you're facing. And that's risks that, that's a risk that the church has to weigh before it moves in that direction. And that's where an attorney can be really helpful in helping you to weigh that risk and figure out what your alternatives are for that.
Thank you. So let's shift a little bit into more digital awareness. A lot of churches has moved to digital worship, and regardless of when churches decide to re-engage in some capacity, that digital worship element is likely not going away. Now that people know what it's like to have their brunch and coffee and Jesus all at the same time. I mean, this is the kind of thing that we kind of like. So as we're looking into that, I'm curious, what are some of the questions that have come to you about worship and about doing that online and in these platforms?
So the biggest question I get right now is about copyright and licensing and permission. And out of those, the number one question I get is, can we show a YouTube video over our Zoom during worship? And so I'm going to answer that because it, like, I hear it so often. So the thing about YouTube is YouTube has its own terms of service. And so YouTube's terms of service say you cannot use this platform for anything other than personal, non-commercial use. And of course, using it for church service is non-commercial, but it's definitely not personal use. So unless you're going to get YouTube's permission to use the content that's been uploaded there, that's already a non-starter. And then the second thing you have to do is get the permission of the person who posted the content on YouTube, because just posting it on YouTube is not a license to be able to stream it or use it in any other capacity. So one of the things that churches have done to work around this is if they're preparing a bulletin that's either posted on their website or that's emailed to their congregation ahead of time, they might have a link to a YouTube video, which is posted. And at a certain point in the service, they might invite the viewers to go and watch that video on their own and then come back to the service. So that's one way to handle that without worrying about the copyright issues that are and licensing issues that are associated with YouTube.
We talked a lot about copyright and the implications for what that would be for you local churches, leaders and pastors as you're doing this kind of planning. And there's another video that we did that will be in the follow-up resources and is on the United Church of Christ YouTube channel about legal considerations for worship and copyright. So you will have access to that on the other side of all of this as well. I get those questions a lot too. A lot of the emails about, how do we do this? And it's very difficult. It's very difficult and it's faithful. And I think a lot for congregations, it comes back to the crystallization of the why of worship. Why is it that we are gathering? And sometimes in times like this, I feel like the why is we are gathering to remind each other that we are not alone in the midst of this shared experience of what for many is very traumatic. We are gathering to remind each other that we are a resurrection people, and some people have had in their understandings of worship up until this point, we are gathering to hear really nice music. And that can be a why. And it's a really hard why for this time. So I want to encourage you to think about the why of worship beyond the experience and performance of it, and into the theological reasonings of why are we coming together now. So in that line, there is a question about playing hymns streamed from our church piano. So if someone is performing something into the service and they're performing it at that moment, or publicizing those lyrics to sing along at home, what kind of considerations should we think about in that circumstance?
So you need a license for that. And
Yeah.
that requires a little bit of background explanation, because people are going, okay, but when I am at home or at my church in an in-person service and the organist is playing a hymn and we are singing along, we do not need a license for that. And that is true. That is an exception in the Copyright Act. Okay, it's called the Worship Services Exception, and it only applies to performance of music, so singing or playing a recording during a worship service. It does not apply to streaming and broadcasting. And that's where our movement into this time of the pandemic has gotten, folks a little sideways, maybe with their licensing issues. You really do need a licensing issue or a license to play and broadcast and stream any music that is protected under copyright. And those are the two options. It's either protected under copyright or it's in the public domain. So just because you don't know whose it is, it doesn't mean it doesn't belong to anybody. It means you need to do a little more work to find that out. And not all licenses are created.
And so, yeah. And I know that like a lot of times people will hear all of that and they'll say like, well, I don't want to do that. Like I know this, and that, that's a human thing, but I want to really encourage you to do the work of it, because your angle first, and then I will add in. So if you speak to it first, then.
Sure. So I have a couple of beginning premises that I use when I talk to people about intellectual property. And that the first is that property belonging to another person shouldn't be used without the owner's permission. And I think that's something we can all get behind for all property, right? We don't like our stuff being used without permission. And that intellectual property is valuable property. It's some of the most valuable property. And that compensation for the use of intellectual property is really a justice issue for the owners of these works. And attribution, also not a substitute for permission. So that's what I say when I start out, and that's always my response when folks are like, this licensing stuff is really hard.
Yeah. Someone has said in the chat to us, we have CCI and one license to play the music. Can we stream it? And the answer to that is if they have expressly said that you can stream it and it's covered under their license. And some of them have said you can stream for CCLI, stream for worship, and it has to be actually within the catalog of things that they have said. So that doesn't cover everything. It does cover some things. And I put in the chat for all of you watching the YouTube link to the previous, no, I put the wrong video in the chat, another YouTube link I was watching, and I will put the correct one in there shortly. Thank you, Leslie. And in the meantime, while that is happening, I do want to name about, I forgot where I was going, Heather. So I'm going to pass it to you to pick up where I may have left off.
Yeah, and I noticed somebody just posted a question that really brings up a good point about what I said about not all licenses are created equal. And the question is, does the live stream use of music like Zoom or Facebook Live fall under any different sort of licenses than pre-recorded and shown via YouTube that can be accessed anytime? And the answer is maybe. All of these licensing companies, these blanket licensing companies, offer different licenses and they have a different menu of options. So the best recommendation I have is to read your license carefully, figure out what it is you're trying to do, give your licensing company a call. I have found that the folks at those companies are very helpful and very interested in making sure that you have the right license to do what you want to do. No doubt, because they're interested in selling a license, but they're also very knowledgeable. And with respect to Facebook Live, I know that CCLI has a streaming license that covers YouTube, but I don't think anyone has one that covers Facebook Live yet. I think CCS covers streaming from your website, but again, check the terms of the license to make sure and give those folks a call if you have questions.
There is some question about the New Century hymnal, and I believe that we have determined that as it has been written for congregational use, that it is expanded in that way. I know we covered it in the previous video explicitly, so I put that in, that is the video I put in the chat, and I encourage you to watch that too. The thing I want to say about attribution is that while attribution is not permission, attribution is in alignment with how are we being attentive to the history of what a piece of music has come from as much as we're able. And with the attribution is part of showing up in some ways for racial justice. And that's part of women of color feminisms, that we say where we've learned things from and from who, we say where pieces of information have come from, because it all comes with a contextual history. And that's true for copyright as well. And as Heather said, all copyright is not equal. You know, some of that has been caught up in ways that are damaging in some of these systems. And it means that if you are being attentive in the legalities of your church and of your worship, the work needs to be done so that you can be consistently attentive and not add an unintended legal battle to your church's worries.
Let's talk about the legal battle for copyright for just a minute, because this can cause real financial damage to churches, and has. This is something every year we get 1 or 2 or 3 churches who get a letter in the mail that says something to the effect of, you posted this photograph on your website and I own this photograph and I've registered this with the US Copyright Office. I did not give you permission to use it. And now you're going to take it down and you're also going to pay me a license fee for it, or else I'm going to sue you in federal court and I'm going to get damages for that.
There are some people who make a living doing that.
There are absolutely people who make a living doing that. And there are also there are also bots, like automated services that crawl across the internet and look for works that are protected by copyright, that law firms use, that licensing firms use to find out these things. And the truth is, if you get taken to court for the use of intellectual property that's registered under the US Copyright Act, the chances are very good that you're going to end up paying something along with heavy duty attorney's fees, because copyright infringement is sort of strict liability. Not knowing that it was copyrighted is not a defense to using it. Because you found it on the internet, or because you found it on some site that said everything here is in the public domain, that's not a defense to using a copyrighted work without permission. So this often causes thousands of dollars, that come off of our church's budgets that they could be using for ministry. And I've settled some of these cases for less, but frankly, these folks have the winning argument when you get that. So let's be careful and attentive to our copyright licensing issues to avoid
And
that.
to be clear, when we're talking about copyright, we're not just talking about music. We're also talking about poetry. We're talking about readings. We're talking about things that are intellectual property of other people.
Music is just the easiest one to deal with, because you can get a blanket license and it'll cover everything in the catalog, which is a lot of stuff. Poetry, speeches, those are not covered by blanket licenses, and you actually have to seek out permission for each one of those. I did notice that we had a question that popped up about fair use and worship, and I wanted to address that really quickly too. A use in worship is not automatically a fair use. Fair use has certain standards that a court is going to apply to determine whether a use is fair. And a good rule of thumb is that if you're using the work to stand on its own, for example, you're reading the poem just to as the poem, to appreciate the poem, that's not fair use. That's using the work to stand on its own. Fair use would be quoting a couple of lines from the poem to support what you're saying in a sermon, perhaps. Fair use, I think we're all familiar with news reporting being a fair use. Some educational uses are a fair use, though not all of them. You can copy maybe one chapter of a book for a class, but you certainly can't provide, photocopy the whole textbook, because it ruins the market for that work. So fair use can be a bit complicated, and a worship use does not automatically equal a fair use.
All right, one more thing about music and copyright before I kind of move us in a little bit of a different direction is that there is a question in the chat about people having their entire worship services on YouTube, including some of the music. And so in your opinion, is it, well, I guess not necessary. How would you like to address that?
So let me address it in the context of an actual question that I got a few weeks ago, which was essentially, we've been recording all of our worship services and they're on YouTube now, and we don't have licenses for them. What should we do? Now we know better, so we're going to do better, and we're just going to take down that content is what we're going to do. And that's going to be the best way to steward your church's assets. I think is a good way of looking at it, because you certainly don't want to be the one who knew better and then didn't take that down and then got hit with the copyright lawsuit later. Does that answer the question? I hope that it does.
To me, it does too. And I know that there's a lot of questions coming in the Q&A. So as we will get to some of them, but we will not be able to address all of them in this conversation. Another thing that people are attentive to for this digital worship experience is about privacy. So if I'm a pastor and we get to the prayers of the people, and I know that Mary is in the hospital, but we don't necessarily know what Mary has. But if someone could go check on her house over on, Brandy Street, that would be great. Is that a great thing to, I mean, how do we address this whole privacy conversation digitally? I mean, I know when I say it in this context, all of you are going, oh, no, 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 no. And it's happened.
It has happened. And so I'm sure there's got to be at least one person who is watching today who has seen my workshop on clergy confidentiality and privilege, and knows that, near the end, I talk about bidding prayers and the privacy concerns that can be implicated and the safety concerns for your congregation. And that's just extra now, right? If we're posting our services on YouTube for the entire world to see, and we talk about Mary and her house on, Bradbury Street, and how you're taking care of her dog and those sorts of things, which all come from these big-hearted good intentions, but can be damaging and can make people unsafe. What we probably want to do is encourage the pastor to bid prayers, maybe via email. Send me an email, I'll get it to the prayer circle or whatever group does that work. Or the pastor can then take it, incorporate it into a prayer that the pastor offers in the online service in a way that protects the privacy of that individual.
And that in some way also goes when somebody's Facebook live streaming and then somebody in the comments is like, I just heard that Brad's with COVID, like things to be attentive to. We can't always predict what our members and our friends and our people attending will do. We can set expectations about how to give information.
That's a really great point. We certainly can't control the behaviors of others, but we can preach what the expectations are for maintaining the privacy of folks. Isn't it fantastic that we're getting people, like I can go to church in California like every Sunday now, even though I live in Ohio. But that's the thing, those are the kinds of things that are happening, is that we now have, a whole slew of folks who are not part of that insular group of the congregation. And folks just might not be aware of that. They might not understand that there are people watching who that information may not need to go to those folks, I guess is what I'm saying.
And of course, this then gets a little bit more complicated when we start thinking about children in worship and how children are in a digital world. So I wanted to name a couple of things about that. The first is that the Insurance Board has a lot of resources about safe church policy, and that is worth looking into and thinking about how it happens in a digital way. And the second is that it is very complicated when you start getting children and you are projecting them outwards in a digital way too. So Heather, I want to invite you to speak more about that too.
Yeah, so just the way I advise churches before the pandemic, when they are doing their videos that advertise their Bible school and those sorts of things, summer vacation Bible school, you don't want to have identifiable shots of children, photographs of children out there. And so if you are doing worship in a way that members can hide their videos, or that you can hide those videos, that's really a best practice. And yeah, we're very concerned about children, but it's also very difficult to know what any particular congregation member is dealing with outside of worship. We don't know what domestic issues there are, what legal issues there are, that having a person's location be known and recorded may not be safe for them. So be attentive to those issues as well, and provide choices to your congregants so that they can make the best decisions for themselves and their children.
Yeah. I mean, I will say in all of this, I think that the conversations about COVID and what COVID-19 and the levels of care that are present are conversations of informed consent. We are nationally thinking about what is informed consent. If I am going to be in the space with this person, I need to know everything that all of their risk values, so that I can make an informed decision about how my actions will then be in alignment with my own safety precautions. And I think that translates to this circumstance too. So, when it comes to worship and children, like what is the level of informed consent that people who are joining your meeting need to know? If it's like, if your screen is on, we might be able to see what's in your background, is something that people may not already know. So just thinking about that in that way too. So anything else about online worship before I kind of bring in a question that we got?
So one of the things that you and I were talking about as we were getting ready for this webinar, I think really bears repeating, is that this pandemic and church is a lot of people's first exposure to things like Zoom and YouTube. They're learning it because their church is now on Zoom and YouTube. So we have to remember that and be attentive to that, and explain things where we might not have thought that we needed to explain things when you and I we're on the Zoom all day long now. But so just be aware that there might need to be more education that needs to be done, and that education might not be able to come from the pastor. Maybe it needs to come from a technologically savvy member of the congregation, or something to like that would be more helpful to people.
Yeah. So we did get a question. I know that you cannot speak to direct circumstances, so I want to name that in the first before we keep going. But you got a question about how is it that churches as organizations, as they begin to learn what the needs are and adjust their staffing, what are some of the things that they need to be attentive to in going forward?
And this is a good question. It's a question a lot of churches are wrestling with right now. So I would say, and some of the information that I'm giving comes directly from the question, which I reviewed. So in general, a private employer can terminate employment of an employee for no reason, or for any reason except for a protected reason. Okay. No longer needing a particular position is a completely valid reason for terminating an employee. A smaller church with fewer than 15 employees, of course, in churches in general, are not going to fall under Title VII for religious discrimination reasons, but those churches may fall under state or local laws that prohibit discrimination that are based on certain protected characteristics. Some states and localities exclude churches and some do not. So again, it's a question of knowing your state and local law. So the church ought to familiarize itself with those laws and make sure that it's making employment decisions based on the needs of the business and not based on any discriminatory practice or protected characteristic of the employee. One thing to keep in mind is that employees of churches are likely not eligible for unemployment compensation through the state. That's a little bit different now that we are sort of in the middle of this pandemic and there's some federal programs that are going on. But I think this kind of looking at staffing is going to extend beyond the expiration date of those federal programs. So if you are looking into a reduction in force in your church, you might consider offering severance payment to those who are going to be losing their positions as a result of restructuring, just to be able to make up for some of that lost income.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
I'm going to bring in a question that came through the Q&A that is directly COVID related, which is that our church is planning on putting together our plan for reopening the sanctuary and other buildings for in-person worship and staff hours. Will our plan, which follows the state OSHA guidelines and gating criteria for opening, legally protect us in the event someone might contract COVID-19 and try and sue the church?
So one thing that my great mentor, Don Clark, who had this position before me, always told me was that anyone can be sued for anything at any time. It's just a question of whether you're going to be sued successfully. So with that in mind, I would say a program, a policy, those things can be helpful, but they're only going to be helpful if the church puts them in place, trains their employees on them, monitors them, and enforces them. So just having a written document and sending it to your employees and say, here you go, this is what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do, congregation. But the church is taking no steps to enforce that, no steps to monitor it, no steps to sort of correct and backtrack. It's probably not going to provide a lot of cover. The flip side to that is it can be very difficult for a plaintiff to prove that they contracted a certain illness from a certain event. So that may be very difficult, but the reality is they're going to figure that part out after they file the lawsuit. And lawsuits are time consuming and emotional. So the things that we can do to avoid them in the first instance, sometimes those are the measures that we take instead. And also check with the insurance board on their website. They have a great document right now that talks about church liability and things that you can do to reduce that, including if you're an IB program member, sort of how that insurance coverage is going to come into play. So I'd really encourage you to check out the insurance board's website.
And I know that, some of the things that I've seen as people are collectively trying to figure out how to do this with integrity and faith and care for their members. One of the things that I've seen is that some churches are considering having their congregants sign a waiver when they come to worship. So I'm going to invite you to speak to that one.
I think we can do better than that for our members. I really do. How any particular court would apply any particular waiver and in any particular circumstance is an open question. And many times waivers are not worth the paper that they are written on in a lawsuit. But I invite you to think about what that means, what you're saying to folks. If you come back to this church, we are asking you to essentially sign away like the rights that you have. And I think as a church, we can do better than that. We can put in place the policies that will help prevent this. We can train our employees. We can train the members of our congregation. We can enforce it. We can not meet if we can't do these things. We can backtrack. We can say, we thought we were ready for this. We were wrong. Let's take 2 steps back. I think we can do that.
Yeah. And, there's been so much conversation about how to do this, and there's a lot of pressure from all sorts of people inside many of our congregations, outside many of our congregations. And, these are leadership decisions that we want to empower you to do in conversation with your local conference, with your local law, and in alignment with their theological necessity to show up for our people. For when I think about all this, it goes back to the why of worship. Is it that people are asking for worship because they're lonely? Is it that people are asking for worship because they remember it being a place of rest? When shown really clear examples, policies, and procedures about what it will be when we come back, is that the kind of worship that they really want and need? And so that, this is an ongoing conversation where, like so much of this, we're getting more information day to day. And in previous webinars, all of which are on a playlist for the United Church of Christ, you can find some recorded webinars about, is it safe to sing about coming back to about worship, and some other pieces about how to be with each other in COVID times with intentionality and care for all people. So as we are kind of wrapping all of this up, I got a question that, where can I find those webinars? We'll post a link in the chat, and it's also in all of the follow-up emails on the United Church of Christ YouTube account in a playlist called Worship and Care for the Entire Church. You're welcome. So as we're wrapping up, Heather, I just want to thank you so much. You know, I really think there's a gift of leadership that you bring to this denomination that can speak to the nuance of many of these repeat questions and offer, with a lot of joy and compassion, a pathway forward that balances, you know, the legalities and the church. I know you enough to know that you have such a heart for church in all of this. And your care for the United Church of Christ and the work that we can continuously do together towards a just world for all is something that really matters to you. So I thank you for coming on, and thank you for bringing that part of yourself and your wisdom to the United Church of Christ into this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed being here.
Will you and all those who are watching now or in the follow-up join me for a moment of prayer? So. Oh, Holy One, bless us in our being together. Hold us in our hard decisions. Empower us to know better and do better. Help us care for our people and reach to you in love, in gratitude, in awe, for help, for wisdom, and for a vision of a world that we can get to together through your Son, Jesus Christ, and beyond. I pray all this in all of your holy names. Amen. And for all of you, be blessed into your day and into the week ahead. Oh, you know, until Thursday.